world. So hi, everybody. I'm Dan Schifrin. I'm the host of StoryForward with Dan Schifrin, which makes sense. I'm with Joel Ben Izzy. Howard Friedman, who runs the Jewish Community Library, is our partner on this. I think Howard might be back on. Howard, are you with us again?
I am.
Wow, that's the voice of God right there.
All right, Howard, do you want to do our formal introduction? And
Sure,
then we'll start
So I'm Howard Friedman. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Library, which is a program of Jewish Learning Works. And I want to welcome all of you to today's virtual program with Joel Ben Izzy in conversation with Dan Schifrin. This is a program of StoryForward in collaboration with the library and with Jewish Live. First, some quick ground rules. Because we do have a large number of attendees, everybody is going to be muted during this program, except for the presenters. However, we do invite you to use the chat function liberally, which for most of you is at the bottom of the screen, and you can use it to both to introduce yourselves and say where you're from, make any comments, offer any questions that you would like the presenters to answer either during or at the end of the program. I'll first introduce Dan, and then he can introduce Joel. Dan Schifrin has taught creative writing at UC Berkeley and San Francisco State University and served as writer in residence at the Contemporary Jewish Museum. He's an author and playwright whose stories and essays have been published widely. As part of a LABA fellowship at the JCC of the East Bay, he's currently writing a play about medieval Jewish Spain and its influence on 21st century America. And he's teaching a class at Stanford that you can actually sign up for, and maybe he can talk about that. He's also the founder of StoryForward, which is a new approach to conversation and literature. And I now turn it over to Dan.
Hello, everybody. Hello again. Yeah, StoryForward. I think the one thing I'll just say is that I'm starting to teach a class on dialogue. What is dialogue? It's a creative writing class through Stanford Continuing Studies. But it's not only about and for writers, it's also for anyone who wants to understand why do we talk? Why are we in conversation? Why do we tell stories? And looking at language, and we'll learn from like the best writers and storytellers. We'll learn from what they've learned from listening to people. And ultimately storytelling is about listening first and talking afterwards. So it's on Zoom, and so you can join me from anywhere in the country. There's more on my website, you can find it. So that's enough of that, thank you. Joel Ben Izzy. Joel and I have been in conversation formally and informally for many years. More formally, Joel is a best-selling author who has traveled the globe, went to some 36 countries in all, in search of the essence and meaning of human story. You see the globe behind him. While the tales he tells come from all over the world, he has a certain fondness and a special fondness for Jewish stories. And a lot of his brain goes directly to Chelm, the Jewish village of fools. And I hope we'll hear something about Chelm today. He's the author of 2 books, The Beggar King and The Secret of Happiness, and Dreidels on the Brain, as well as many award-winning and hilarious CDs. His website is also in the chat. You can go check it out, get some books, whatever you want. Joel, thank you so much for joining us.
Dan, nice to be here, meeting you in Zoom land.
Yeah.
And we used to we thought the world beyond, but no, this is it. This is the Zoom land, wherever that is.
It is crazy. The whole thing is crazy. So Joel, I think the most important thing is for us to assure everybody on the call that if there are any Zoom bombers, that you and I are prepared. Howard will be doing the kind of making sure that people get karateed out. But during that time, you and I will figure out a way to differentiate between what we call the all-rightniks and the
alt-rightniks.
Right.
So we'll be running naked across the screen.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And my thought is that if that happens, what we should do is just pretend this is part of the Christian botany annual meeting, and we'll just start reading from Corinthians. And
it's not?
It might be.
All right, all right.
Okay, so Joel, we had a conversation not too long ago about Zoom, right? And about storytelling, and about how there's something about the technology that has changed the way we are kind of relating to people. And you made this joke about, getting closer to the screen or not getting closer to the screen in terms of connecting to people or not. And then we were talking about this idea of what it means to be close to the fire. And so can you expand a little bit about that? What does it mean to be close to the fire as a storyteller? And can we approach that in Zoom or no?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot lately because I've been on Zoom a lot. I'm teaching some courses at Stage Bridge in Oakland, which is a senior performing arts center. And just great to see some of those students here on Zoom call. And so we've been really learning, like, how do you tell stories on Zoom? You get close. And then I've been talking to a lot of therapists lately because I know a lot of therapists, and some like get really close and really like want to get the, and then some, want to be far back. And what I remembered was a storyteller who passed away not long ago. I'd been thinking of him recently, Steve Sandfield. And he was a storyteller who he was one of the first voices I came to hear. Something about every story he told, I would remember exactly what he said. And I remember going with him once to a storytelling festival, and afterwards I said, we saw a lot of tellers, and I said afterwards, Steve, what did you think? He said, I didn't see anyone really very close to the fire. I said, well, what's that mean? And he said, he said, I think of artists as people kind of like kind of people sitting around the fire, as storytellers. And we play this balance between those who just sort of stay far away and keep a safe, comfortable distance. And, let's face it, there are storytellers and artists who kind of phone in their response, like, oh, this one always works, so I'll do this. And then there are storytellers who just get too close to the fire and burn up. We think of like Lenny Bruce, who was a comedian, but all those people who just, got too close to that. And so he said, but the art is partly finding a way to be close enough to the fire and be there and make that real without burning up. And, and I learned after he died that Steve Stanfield, who's wonderful, if you can find any of his recordings online, he was the best man at Leonard Cohen's wedding. That because they used to live on Idra together in Greece, and I think that may have been something from Leonard Cohen, that notion, but I don't know. Anyway, so as I think about being close to the fire, I think, well, so here we are in this Zoom land. What does it mean? As we're talking through screens, and no, I don't have any idea how this thing actually works, but to get to the real essence of it. So that's been the challenge lately.
Well, it occurs to me just as you're talking that, if we could imagine all those years ago, and now too, but in the early human times, sitting around the fire and being told a story about kind of mythical beings, a story about the origin of our community, how things work beyond our ability, right? And the idea that we would be transported through a portal across the universe, across time and space. And that's kind of what the power of story was and is. This is like that too, in a way. Technology allows us, the screen is kind of like a portal into kind of another world. Like we're in bedrooms and living rooms and kitchens of people around the country, around the world. It's strange and magical, as well as being pedestrian and annoying.
That, and I got to point out, at least in my screen, Dan, you said it's like we're in a portal. Pros like that. So there's an old term that I love in talking about storytelling. Maybe it came from anthropologists. The notion of a boundary walker, right? That is, if you can imagine that scene around the fire, you have your tribe, you live in the valley, and you gather around that fire, and really you're sort of trying to figure out what the hell is going on, which we're still trying to do, right? even more so. So a character might be somebody at this fire, who is explaining what happened and what those are, things sparkling in the sky that we see and why they're there. But maybe there's a character around that fire who's a boundary walker. And that is the value that you have is the sort of the known world. to you, and it goes up to that mountain there in the distance. And then, and then one day there's somebody, Ugg, let's call her, or Ag, let's call him. They walk up and they wander and wander, and they go over the crest of that known world, and they come back and tell you what they saw and who they met. So it's always been a function of storytelling as boundary walker. We go to the edge of what's known, and we sort of glimpse beyond. So suddenly to be doing this all through Zoom, I've been to Zoom Shivas, a Zoom yoga class, a Zoom retreat, and Zoom surprise parties, which are great because they last 10 minutes. We're exploring, we're on that liminal zone. And this is the new liminal zone where we all seem to be these days.
As we're talking about this idea of boundaries and journeying and going beyond, as I mentioned in the kind of intro, you've been to dozens of countries and kind of listened to and explored and learned from storytelling communities all around the world. Have you noticed certain similarities between, all the different cultures and communities that you've looked at and studied? And would you be able to relate Jewish stories and storytelling ideas to that larger, are Jews like everybody else, or are we like everybody else, only more so or less so, or what is it all about?
I would say that everybody likes to laugh. And this is because that's the lens I view things through, and different things make us laugh, and one thing that I've noticed, one could do a whole book about sort of what makes different cultures laugh, and probably somebody has studied that. But one thing that I've noticed is that we Jews tend to laugh at ourselves more. That is there's Italy. My first real gig as a storyteller was at the International School of Roma, Scuola Internazionale di Roma, which was really this old villa on La Storta, just outside of Rome, and they got me there because I was looking for work, and I'd written to every place I could think of that might have an international audience and said, I will be traveling in Europe and coming and telling stories. Would you like to be included on my itinerary? And they wrote and said, we would love to have you. Our last storyteller disappeared mysteriously, and we will pay you 1 million lira. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to be a millionaire. This is fantastic. And 1 million lira was about $200 at the time, but it sure sounded cool to be making 1 million lira. So I ended up at this school, and I learned that there's a way Italians laugh. A lot of people laugh at when somebody falls down. There's the buffoon, that's sort of the bump and there's something funny about somebody rolling down the stairs. Not if you're the guy rolling down the stairs, not if you're the one they land on. But what it's helped me do is sort of look to say, what is it particularly about Jewish humor that brings this up? And it's really that way of looking at ourselves and laughing. I think this is why you mentioned Helm. You say Helm. Well, you mentioned Helm, and Helm is this perfect source of Jewish humor. And I just learned recently that I thought this was old. This is about a century old, and it actually came from a German. Jokes in a German town, and it traveled to Helm, but it really stuck with the Jews, because whereas it began as sort of jokes about people who are just silly, it evolved to be stories of people who are overly analytical. Example, you're probably wondering, two Hamites walking along, right? It's a day today is sunny here. I don't know where people are in Zoom land, but it's a day that's one of those days it's a little cloudy, a little sunny, back and forth. It could rain or maybe sunny. The two Hamites walking along, one has an umbrella, one doesn't. The one without the umbrella, suddenly the clouds burst open, and the one without the umbrella turns to the one with the umbrella and says, "Nu," which is a Yiddish word that literally means "nu." Open your umbrella. He said, I could open my umbrella, but it's full of holes. It lets the rain right through. He says, Why did you bring it then? He says, I didn't think it would rain. And to me, this is a particular aspect of human nature. You know, this is a story that makes people laugh twice. But for those who don't know Chelm is the place where people are so foolish, they think they're wise, and they sit stroking their beards with one eye closed. Yeah, yeah. In Chelm, I think everyone has beards. Men, women, children, dogs, cats, boys, girls. They have an expression. They say a goat can have a beard, but that does not make him a rabbi. That's what they say. Nobody knows what it means, but that's what they say. But the people of Chelm spend their time pondering questions like, why is it the days are longer in summer and shorter in winter? And after pondering this for weeks, they finally turn to Chaim Yankel, the wise. Who's the wisest of the Chelmites? You know how wise he is? You're probably wondering how wise he is. How wise is he? He's so wise that each night when he goes to bed, he has two glasses by the side of his bed. One is a glass of water and one is empty. And the people of Chelm wonder, they say, two glasses, eh? Why? He said, I'll tell you, if I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm thirsty, I drink the glass of water. But if I wake up and I'm not thirsty, I drink the glass without water. So they turn to Chaim Yankel, they say, Chaim Yankel, why is it the days are longer in summer and shorter in winter? He thinks, ponders, he says, well, have you noticed in summer it's hotter? Yes. Have you noticed in winter that it's colder? Yes, we've seen that too. It's science. When it gets hot, the days expand. When it gets cold, they contract. It's simple like that. So Chelm, there's something about Chelm and humor that is particularly fitting, and I think it's one of those things that thrives during difficult times. You know, and
I've heard those stories before, and every time you tell them, I have to stop myself from laughing, and they didn't do a very good job. So that started me thinking about Hasidic stories, which is kind of the Chelm stories and the Hasidic stories are often the stories from Eastern Europe that most folks know the best in terms of the Jewish tradition outside of like the ancient canon. I read this book about Nachman of Bratslav, who was one of the great early Hasidic masters. And in one of the descriptions of him telling stories, he would basically stay up with his people half the night, and he would improvise these unbelievably complicated stories within stories and wheels within wheels. And there was always a sense that maybe he wouldn't quite get the story out. He wouldn't quite bring it to a conclusion. And the language to describe him was less, it wasn't that he was close to the fire exactly, but it was almost like he was going up so high that they were afraid he was going to fall. Right? So there's something about how close can you get to a moment of danger? How close can you go to some knowledge that is forbidden before, you're done?
And he's a great example because he was just a miserable, suffering guy with all kinds of physical ailments who died young, and who really would go from his misery and suffering into this land of stories. And you read his stories like the Seven Beggars, they're very complicated and intricate. They go for days, and Howard Schwartz just did a new book with Rabbi Nachman's stories, really beautiful. He was and this was in the before time, back when people used to travel and gather in places, back, if you can remember.
I've heard of that. My parents used to talk about that.
But there's a way that storytelling has such bravery. Here's a little Rabbi Nachman story that captures that. And there aren't many little ones, but I've always loved this one. It's a gorgeous day. A guy is walking down through this valley. It's like a canyon almost. On either side's high peaks, and he looks up, and what does he see? But across from one peak to another is a cable stretching across the valley. He looks at the cable and thinks, why would there be a cable from one side of the valley to the other? He doesn't have to wait long before he sees on one mountain peak a clown there's a clown. And the clown, for some reason, who knows what, has a wheelbarrow. This in itself is odd, but what's even stranger, here's Rebbe Nachman telling us, is that clown begins to walk on that cable, tightrope walker, with that wheelbarrow going across that way up there without a net. And the man stares at him, just dumbstruck, looking up. The clown at the wheelbarrow, he goes all the way across and then takes the wheelbarrow, comes on down and greets the man there waiting, who's just dumbstruck. He's gobsmacked. The clown says hello. The guy said, "That was amazing. I've never seen anything like it. You went all the way across without a net. It was just brilliant." Clown said, "Do you like it?" He said, "Yeah, I thought that was great. I thought that was just amazing." And they talk a little bit about this and that. And the clown said, "Did you see my footwork?" He says, "Yeah, the footwork was really terrific." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Did you see the sort of sense of balance at one time when the breeze came and I was kind of like kept my?" Yeah. The guy says, "Yeah, that was really good too." And the clown says, "Did you notice sort of the way I did my breathing things? And did you notice?" And this goes from a discussion about like how great the clown's balancing was on the tightrope to like he's fishing for compliments. Finally, the clown says, Did you notice that one time it was like I just kind of stood there and it was just such confidence and just really aced it." Finally, the guy says, "Look, all right, it was brilliant. Okay, tightrope, Plum Valley, love the whole business. You're freaking genius. Okay, great, thank you. You're best tightrope walker ever. Is that what you want to hear?" The clown says, "That's good. Now get in the wheelbarrow, and I'll do it again." And there's something when you talk about Rebbe Nachman taking risks.
Yeah.
There's that sort of leaping into the unknown, which is, by the way, what we all are doing these days. Just last week, I don't know. Have you heard there's a pandemic? Have you heard about it?
I heard. Joel, I guess related to that, thinking about the kind of the apocalyptic nature of these times, but also about a stunt like that. So I saw in your bio that I said you had been to 36 countries. And so when I see 36, I think, aha, the Lamed Vavniks. Right? So if people know the Lamed Vavniks, Lamed Vav is the numerical number when you add those two Hebrew letters together to make 36. There's this idea that in the world at all times, there must be 36 essentially righteous people upon whom the world rests. And if there is any time less than 36 people, somehow the world collapses. 36 is like the minimum number of righteous people that it takes for the world to exist. It's like there must be 10 people in Sodom and Gomorrah with Abraham's, arguing with God. So when I think about stories and storytelling, sometimes I think about stories and storytelling are so important to us as a community. And by us, I mean the human community, Jews also, but to everybody, that I wondered, like, what would happen if there were less than 36 storytellers in the world? What if there were less than 36 stories? Is there a way that the world could continue without there being enough people telling stories to support us and to give us humor and to give us succor? What would happen if there were only 35 stories?
Hey, that's a good question. I mean, I think there's so many more than that. That's not a problem. But the way I thought you were going to go with the Lamed Vavniks, because the tradition is that there's these 36, and there are 36 at any time, but, and it's always a but in a Jewish story, if they would ever get together in one place, this would enter in the age of the Messiah. We would live in an era of peace. And I would add, the Talmud makes a little obscure comment that no one's ever said, but it says, if it should happen that the Lamed Vavniks would gather together all in one place, they would discover something that would be, and they use a Hebrew phrase, vaccine for coronavirus, and nobody knows what it means. But the 36 coming together, there would be a vaccine. And I don't know, it's just all, no one's ever understood, but it's one of those mysteries in the Talmud. I think the truth is, I don't know if it's, I never think it's about how many stories we have. I think it's always about how they're connected. Like you began this introducing me by saying we've had all these conversations over the years, but if I could correct, I really think we've just had one conversation that started maybe 20 years ago, and we keep continuing it. And today we invite people to join us on Zoom land.
That sounds right. That sounds right. Hey, Joel, I'm going to take a second and check in with my friend Howard.
All right. Well, look at the chat too.
Howard, if you are there and not managing any other technical emergencies, what's happening in Chatland? What are people saying? Are there any compliments for Joel and I being up on this like wheelbarrow thing, or like?
I think you need to balance better on the wheelbarrow if you want that praise.
Yeah.
No, not that much. Just questions about sources of humor. I would invite people to contribute their questions to the chat to really comment if there's anything that you want them to address. And I'll keep them apprised of that.
I have one.
Don't be shy. Yeah.
I have one. The question is this. I was thinking about something my dad said, and I think of it in the context of too soon. You know, when do we start making jokes and humor? You know, when is it too soon? And I would put this out to those in Zoom land, and you can vote with your reactions button. There's a reaction button on your screen, and I'll ask first for thumbs up on one, then for thumbs up on the other. Howard will make up a number and give the response. It'll be just like the Electoral College, right? So my father used to say, humor is especially effective in dealing with things that aren't funny. And I wonder, is this true? And while you think about that, I'm going to ponder, because this is, you know, this is not our first rodeo. I would say we're not our first bullfight as the bull. For Jews, right, we have a long history of things going badly. Not always, but enough that like there's plenty of stories, and we like we do a dance about, well, is this something to tell stories about or not? You know, when is it appropriate? Is it too soon? Right? And so, and it's a question I put to all of you out there just to mull over. Well, I'll tell you a story, because I mentioned Steve Sanfield, who has been on my mind and is close to the fire. He used to tell a story which was more of a joke, but it was a favorite, and he would always describe it as his guilty pleasure. He would tell a story from the Holocaust about a Jewish man walking along, and who does he see walking towards him in the street but Adolf Hitler, right? The Jewish guy, he doesn't know what to do. There's nowhere to go. And Hitler says, Jew. He pulls out a gun and points it right at the man. He says, what? And Hitler, in his perverse humor, looks down on the street, and there is some dog chara, left by a dog still there. And he points to the Jewish man and he says, Jew, eat that. What can he do? There's Hitler with a gun, and he points, and he bends down, and he starts to eat, and Hitler thinks this is the funniest thing he's ever seen. He just is laughing, and his sides are splitting, laughing so hard he drops the gun. As he drops the gun, the Jewish man runs, grabs the gun, picks it up, and points at Hitler and says, now, you, Hitler, eat that. And Hitler bends down and starts to eat. The Jewish man sees a chance. He drops the gun. He runs home. And when he gets home, he says to his wife, you'll never guess who I had lunch with today. So that's the story. To say it's in bad taste is an understatement. But when Steve told it,
literally.
But Steve, when Steve told it, this is what made Steve Sanfield. He said, you know, that was my guilty pleasure. He said, because I always told that story, and part of me thought, you know, I shouldn't be telling it. I really should not be telling it. One day, and then he said, and sure enough, one day I told it, and even as the audience was laughing, I looked in the back and I saw a woman looking right at me. And after they left, she came up to me and she said to me, she said, that story you told about the man with Hitler, the dog poop. Yeah. And he said, even as she addressed me, I could see like the numbers on her arm. And she said, that story you told. She said, I was in Auschwitz. And Steve said, yeah, I had this coming. And she said, I was in Auschwitz. That was 42 years ago. She said, and from then until now, until tonight, I haven't left until I heard your story.
Mm.
So,
Wow.
yeah, Steve was a great storyteller, and that was close to the fire,
Yeah.
and that's so let's try our poll here. Humor, this is like some debate they do on NPR.
Right.
Humor is a particularly effective way of dealing with things that aren't funny. Let's see thumbs up if you can do that reactions button for how many yeses, and we'll get Howard to count them. All right, and we'll give a moment while Howard does that, and we'll go to another topic. So yes means for yes. Or can you see in gallery view?
Yeah, I can see him too.
All right.
Huh. Not as many as I
We
thought.
have a split decision.
All right. So wait. And who says? Well, yeah. I guess if the thumbs down, it says no. Howard, what do we got?
Yeah, it seems about a half.
I love that. That's perfect.
Interesting. That sounds about right.
And is there a little sign on Zoom that goes, it depends. It's either the applause or the thumb. What do you think, Dan? You're a playwright and
yeah, I feel like I think humor is really an extraordinary instrument because I think humor allows us to get to things at a diagonal. It allows us to penetrate and to be penetrated in ways that we don't expect. The absurdity of the humor, the thing that we're not expecting. I think the social value of that is that it creates this kind of unexpected and automatic empathy between people. It forces us to let our guard down in some way. And so I think there's something so valuable about humor, almost no matter what the topic is, to some degree. I mean, there are context things. Like you're telling this story about a Jewish storytelling mentor and about the response of a survivor of Auschwitz. We're in a kind of like a cultural context here where all that makes sense. If we were in another context and someone else was telling that story, it would be different, right? I mean, so it's not only about literally the content, it's about the context and about the community. And so there's kind of a lot of pieces to like what makes something funny or not. But I think there is something about humor, even dangerous humor, that allows us to try on certain uncomfortable emotions in a way that may inoculate us in some way. I don't know, that's my thought.
It's funny how our language has a subtext, inoculate us through these. There's a subtext of something going, and I don't know what it is. I just sense something's happening in the world outside. There's like a disturbance in the forest. You notice it, Luke? But that is so true. But that's the beauty of storytelling. The storyteller knows the listener.
Right.
And that's something that we get. But we kind of know, depending on who we can see there in the little squares. But it's an ongoing thing. But I think partly it's the effort to really make those connections.
Yeah, I like that. Let's go with that.
Well, one thing I've noticed about Zoom, because I saw in the chat there was a question about Zoom as a virtual storytelling. It's pretty good for storytelling. You can go to the speaker view and you can pin on a speaker and watch them if you want. But it's good for storytelling because it lets you have that suspension of disbelief, as opposed to singing, which when you have a group of people trying to sing, I hosted a virtual Passover Seder, and that's sort of all the little lag time that you get, the latency, which nobody understands quite. That makes just singing sound exactly wrong. But there is a way that there's some kind of magic that connects through story, even on a screen, I think.
I would agree.
So we have a question, if I could
Yes,
share
please,
it.
Howard.
So one is, aside from the Passover Seder, which you just brought up, Joel, what are other ways that we can weave Jewish storytelling throughout the year? And this was in particular regard to storytelling to children, but it really could apply to all of us.
Oh, that's great. I think that's it's a good question, because one thing that the Jewish tradition does, and I think any tradition does, but Jewish tradition does it well, is it bakes in sometimes for that. And for example, when my kids were young, each week on Shabbat, we would say, so looking back over this week, what's something you'll remember? Right? That you think when you look back, and like imagining from the future, looking back, what will you remember? Was there a sweet moment? Was there a painful moment? Not was the high point of the week, but actually something you remember. I think that's one. I think too, the other thing about storytelling, what makes it work is having some time and space. And that's one of the hardest things to do, or has been, certainly in the before time, because I don't know about you listening out there, I always felt the world was just spinning too fast. There was too much happening, and there was just ongoing activities, and overbooked all the time. And I ask anybody, how are you? I've been really busy lately. So partly what happens with storytelling is to carve out the time. I use the metaphor of a story string. I use my glass of water here. This is from Chaim Yankel the Wise. And this is the way I teach classes, but it's something anybody can do. When my daughter was in preschool, they would take a glass of water, they'd pour a bunch of sugar in it, and they'd take a pencil, we'll use a pen, we're improvising here now in the time of coronavirus, and they would tie a string to it and put it over the top of the glass, right? And the string would hang down in the water, and then eventually, what happens? Crystals form, and those crystals grow larger, and when they pull the string out, then the kids could see that, understand the science, and then eat the candy. So this wasn't really a lesson in diet and health. This is a lesson in science and making candy. But I've always thought that's the way stories work, which is you carve out that time, you let the water settle, and you drop in that story string. So for the Shabbat example, that was what's a moment that's memorable, and then you take like a minute of silence to think about it. And it's that minute of silence that really makes it go, right? And the first one that comes to mind is that one to share. And then you see it with all your senses, right? You try to see, and writing, Dan, you teach writing. Sometimes we write to the eyes, and write to the ears and speak to the eyes. But we want to use all the senses and bring that in. So back again, in answer to the question Howard read, I think that people, and especially parents, have a lot of opportunity to look for some of these strings. Give themselves a minute of silence with a string like, think about a place you used to love to go. A place, and let yourself go there and spend just a minute there with all your senses, with all your the smells, the sounds, the time of day, the time of year. And if you find a time to describe that to your children, that becomes like a lovely thing. And it's not necessarily a story. It may or may not be a conflict. But another story string I might use is think of a teacher you'll always remember, right? Or think about a photograph you have that's meaningful to you. And you might tell the story, and then at the end of the story, you might show that photograph. Think about a piece of music that's been really meaningful in your life. Again, you may tell that story, and then at the end, play that music. So these story strings are great. And you know what, Dan? What I can do is I can email you afterwards a list of some of these, and if you can put them on your website, then people who are watching could have that.
I think that's great, Joel. Thank you. I think, Howard, we have an opportunity also to send out to folks just a thank you email, and we'll include any of those extra things that we might think of on the call. That's great. So we'll do both. Joel, I just, listening to that, I had two thoughts. One was, boy, it was in that old Woody Allen movie back when we were allowed to watch them and enjoy them.
Wartime?
Yeah, it was about, it was the Alan Alda character in, my sister will know this if she's on the call. Maybe she can put it in chat. Humor is tragedy plus time. Is that the phrase?
Yeah, or maybe misery plus time.
Misery plus time equals comedy. So there's something profound about time in comedy. And then I was thinking, going all the way back to sitting around the campfire. And when we sit around the campfire, like when we're camping, we sit around the campfire, and time no longer has the same kind of meaning. We know it's dark. We know at some point it'll get light again, but we can stay as long as we want and talk for as long as we want, and all the stories and the humor that comes out of that. Also, there's something about the world slowing down, being in that place. And in a weird way, there's one piece of the silver lining, so to speak, about now where time has slowed down for us. Although, I would give that up, obviously, to not be in this place. But yeah, I think so. But there's something about the slowing down of time. That's also what Shabbat is, I think, having that day, where Nachman and Bratslav could talk for 16 hours straight on a manic rant or whatever, all the way through the night.
I kind of love, first of all, your sister wrote Crimes and Misdemeanors.
Crimes and Misdemeanors.
So thank you, Dan, sister. Deborah. And there's something that's so lovely that's happening to time now. For one thing, and it's I don't know about you. You're a little younger than me, Dan, but I spent a good chunk of my childhood bored, and sitting around summer afternoons. What should we do? Sure is hot. I don't know, and I've always joked with audiences to say, when I was a kid, we were bored. It was a very creative time. Now, kids today aren't bored because we have schedules and we have classes we go to and we have play dates arranged and everything's so fully booked. I said, now they are offering a class you can take in boredom, and that you can actually go learn to sit there and they teach children how to be bored. I've said that to audience after audience, and no one's ever questioned me. They go, really? That sounds good. Where? And then I finally say, wait, I just made that up. That's not true, right? They don't have a class in boredom. We're kind of taking this class in boredom, and it's such a fruitful time, from for one thing, we find ourselves together, and we, you walk with appropriate social distance, of course. And because of the social distance, you do this eye thing where you're coming and you look and you do your kind of do-si-do to say you're 6 at least feet. It's this kind of lovely way people have of relating to each other and everyone you meet. And there's something that has the capacity to bring out the to bring out the humanity in people. There's a story. Yafa Ilyich had a book called Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust that you must have known it. And they had a story. It was about the Rabbi of Danzig. I'd been thinking of this story because, and I'll just paraphrase it. The rabbi in the town of Danzig. Was a tall, dignified, handsome man. He had a silver-handled cane. He would hold court each day, and people would listen to his opinions. And as he would, but before starting each day in his rabbinic court, he would go for a walk. And as he walked through the town, he would look at those flowers. He would look at the colors, and he would smell the things to smell, but most importantly, he would greet each and every person he met with a good morning. And they would say, "Good morning, Rebbe." And this walk went all the way to the far end of town, which is like where he found himself at the farm of an ethnic Polish farmer named Herr Muller. And he would always end the walk by seeing Herr Muller out working. He'd say, "Good morning, Herr Muller." And Herr Muller, of course, wasn't Jewish, he was an ethnic Polish farmer. He would say, "Good morning, Rabbi." And with this, only when he'd done this would he turn back and go, and then he would hold court and do his teaching and learning. So along came the war and all the things that happened and the Nuremberg laws, and suddenly he was no longer able to walk. He was under house arrest. And eventually he was taken off to one of the camps. And this camp, his life turned completely different. And 6 months later, he looked nothing like himself. His head of hair, his beard had been shaved to nothing. He'd gone from being tall and strong to being hunched over and thin. He was weak, he was starving. And he was standing in line after line for food, for inspection, the showers. And he found himself in one such line, long line with people, another line, and he was being pointed to the right or to the left, right, to the left. And as he came to the front, he realized this was a selection line. He was being judged to live or to die. And he found himself so angry that someone could play God with a bayonet pointing right back to the barracks, left to the showers. And he decided he would take whatever energy he had to scream at the Nazi in front of him. And when he went to scream, he looked up and all he could say was, "Good morning, Herr Muller." And Herr Muller stopped for a moment and said, "Good morning, Rabbi. What times these are." Right. The next day, somehow he was transferred to another camp. And when Yafa Ilyich collected this story in the 80s, he was still alive in Brooklyn, 84 years old, teaching his congregation. And you always tell it, he said, "So you see, the moral is that no matter what happens in life, we must begin each day by greeting our neighbors and saying, 'Good morning.'"
Yes, koach. That's not a story I knew. I have that book somewhere, but that's an amazing story. Joel, it is 2:57.
Oh my God. And you have a birthday party to get
My
to.
my daughter just turned 7. Her birthday party is in 3 minutes. It's on Zoom.
You're inviting everybody?
Everybody can come. I need to probably practice the electric slide one more time before we do our dance jump rope party. So we will finish in a couple minutes. I want to see if there's anything else, Joel, from you or from Howard or on the chat, some unturned rock of conversation and humor that we can find in the couple minutes we have left.
One question that was asked is, what sort of humor is effective in these apocalyptic times? And do we need leaders with a genuine sense of humor?
Ooh, I'll take the second one.
Yeah.
Because this is one of the most striking things about, and I'm not going to say his name because I just don't like to advertise for him. It's a brand, but I'll just call him, can I say blusterfuck on the air? Howard.
Sure.
Yeah. So I'll call him Blotus,
Blotus.
For belligerent, lying, overgrown tyrant of the United States. He has no sense of humor. And this was something we discovered. And one way, I mean, it's I didn't come expecting an answer to answer any of our questions, because we start with questions, we get more. But do we need a sense of humor these times? How can we tell stories at a time like this? I think we have a control where we see somebody who's incapable of actual humor. And it's a weird deficit that goes with a narcissistic personality disorder.
Yeah.
And when he canceled the correspondence dinners, and he, even when Obama had made some joke about him, and he stomped out and said, "I'll show you," and and now he's doing that thing he does, which is to just try to destroy the world. But that's what happens if you don't have humor. That's the nth degree. So what was the first part of the question?
The first was really, what kind of humor is effective in these apocalyptic times?
That's it. Well, I have a half answer, a half ask.
I have the other half.
Okay, great. So we'll together we'll sit on this problem. Yeah, no, I just think increasingly about the role of our late night comedians, so to speak, and about how I feel the humor and the satire I get on those shows, Stephen Colbert and such, I feel both educated and somehow renewed. I feel I don't feel helpless when I hear them talk about the news in some way. There's something about the humor, the relief valve, that allows me neither to be complacent nor to be undone by what's happening. So I don't know, maybe Stephen Colbert is our prophet. He's our Abraham Joshua Colbert.
Yeah. Well, I'll add to that. It's when I was in college, I wrote a paper on Nietzsche for freshmen, and it was
we've all made that mistake.
It was the birth of tragedy. And it was taking the Apollonian and Dionysian, which he said these combined to form the Greek notion of tragedy. The Apollonian, the dreamlike quality; the Dionysian, the sort of the drunken quality. That perfect combination made that. And my thesis was arguing with Nietzsche that we're now in the modern age because God is dead, and so now comedy is that form. And I then combined Steve Martin with Lenny Bruce and got Woody Allen. It was kind of arrogant, and then I had enough arrogance to call up Woody Allen and say, "Am I full of it?" And I didn't have his numbers. I called the White House, which used to have everybody's number, and they said, "Oh, we'll put you through." I can't believe. But the point of the story is, I believe that humor that lets us ask questions, that lets us wonder, and lets us look at ourselves. I think there's a lot that's effective. And I love, there's been so much, one of the comments pointed out, there's been so much humor that's come up through this. It's just great. It's like cracks in the ground. And you hike in Greece, cracks in the ground, you see fig trees coming up in every crack in the ground. Or it's just been lovely to see that humor that lets us laugh and makes us wonder. There's a book I've meant to write for years, but I don't know how to spell the title. And I can say it, but I can't spell it. The book is called Getting to Huh, which is, and you could spell it H-U-H, right? But I wouldn't want people to think to getting to huh, because that's not it.
Totally different. Yeah.
It's totally different. But getting to huh, and that little bit that opens up our mind and makes us wonder. And I think humor does that better than anything, like getting that little bit out. And stories do that as well. And I'm particularly drawn to humorous stories. But you had sent me a quote earlier, Dan. I was thinking it was from Elie Wiesel, who had from the gates of the forest talked about the lineage from Rabbi Nachman and going on. And the moral of that, as he wrote, was God created man because God loves stories. And I've often said God created humans because God loves stories. But taking the quote, God created man because God loves stories, I think you could also say we created God for the same reason. That this is that chance to look and find mysticism and meaning.
Joel, maybe that's a great place to end on. And I wonder if I could thank you and everybody on the call by saying, huh.
That's great. And I'll just add, someday I'll be updating my website and sending out a blog about this. So if people want to go to storypage.com, that's my website. I have a Facebook page you can find too. And Dan, I'd love to be on again because it feels like we've made another notch in this conversation that's going to be ongoing.
We'll do a 2.0. Maybe, Howard, you'll send something out to folks. Maybe we can ask a question about what the topic of the next Joel Ben Izzy conversation should be. Well, maybe in the summer we'll do another one, and we'll take a poll on the email.
Okay, start counting.
Shavua Tov, everyone, and welcome to Bedtime Stories for Grownups. Whatever your age and wherever you are, because it's always bedtime somewhere. I'm Magid Andrew Raymer, and I'll be your host each week, reading you about 30 minutes of stories from an unpublished book, Rivka's Sewing Machine, Modern Jewish Tales of Magic and Mystery, that I hope will put you to sleep. Because this is the ancient job of all storytellers, to guide you into dreamland. And in this new and challenging time, we need all the new dreams we can get. The name of the series ripples back to my first published book, Little Pictures, long out of print. The original subtitle of the book was Bedtime Stories for Grownups. But my editor, Chris Cox, changed it to Fiction for a New Age. So the series is a kind of snarky tribute to Chris, who was a wonderful storyteller himself and a member of the gay writers group, The Violet Quill. So check them out and check out Chris, who sadly died of AIDS in 1990. Now, quills come from birds, and there will be winged beings rippling through the stories you'll be hearing, but don't get out your birdwatching glasses, as my focus is on a different winged tribe who ripple back to another book, Ask Your Angels, which I co-authored with Alma Daniel and the late Timothy Wiley. This book was brought into the world by noted editor Cheryl Woodruff, who wants you to know that it's a classic work. Thank you, Cheryl, for all of your amazing work. If you've read any of my earlier books, including Torah Told Different, or the comic dystopian Fragments of the Brooklyn Talmud, published last year, both with cover art by San Francisco artist and gallery owner Anne Marguerite Herbst, you'll be familiar with the way that I play around with stories, telling and retelling them as storytellers are guided to do. Rivka's Sewing Machine, Modern Jewish Tales of Magic and Mystery, is dedicated to Andy Scott Dumas and Mark Horn, author of Tarot and the Gates of Light, a timely guide to using tarot to count the Omer. You'll meet Mark and Andy in a moment or five, and you'll also be meeting Rivka and her sewing machine. As for the modern, I use that word to refer to anything that happened in the last 100 years or so of linear Earth time. And for the magic and mystery, that you'll find out soon. As for Jewish, I want to thank our hosts, Dan Libenson and Lex Rofberg, creators of Judaism Unbound. Please check it out if you haven't, as it's a marvelous resource for the time we're living in. They, along with April Stern, are our guides on Jewish Live, the magical, mystical
I'll tell us what you want to hear from Joel, and we'll make it happen.
That sounds great. So
Great.
Thanks, both of you. This was really just a wonderful time, and very, very appreciative.
Thanks
Right.
for Zoom hosting us and stay.
two dimensions that we're meeting in right now. The first of 3 stories that I'll be sharing with you today as an introduction to the book. A story both.
And find something to laugh at.
Yeah, let's do it. Take care,
Happy
everybody.
birthday to your daughter.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
As a good story should be. So take off your shoes. My baby shoe, and get comfortable. Put a soft pillow behind your head, stretch out, relax, and imagine that we're all gathered together around a cozy little campfire, tenderly caressed by a million shining stars. And if you start to snore, don't worry, everyone is muted. Sweet dreams. A storyteller's story. This could be a true story, but what is true and what's a story? That, dear listener, I leave up to you, knowing that it might be a question of little importance at the beginning of our shared journey, shared in ways that marvelously defy what our senses tell us about time, space, and the intricate ways that they dance together. For more information on this, please contact Albert Einstein. His email address is e=mc.round@fourthheaven.gov. His mobile phone number is 548-757-2248, 59554-112-3389, but he doesn't like to text. In September of 1995, I suspect that I was in Colorado, studying with a group of other people. And I believe that one afternoon, my friend Mark read us an old Hasidic tale about Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. And I seem to think that afterwards, Mark and Andy and I went for a walk, during which it's very likely that we asked if anyone was writing contemporary Jewish mystical tales. But I don't think we knew anyone who was. Later, on the way back to my room, I'm quite certain that the title story of this book flashed into my head all at once. After that, I quite surely began to write other stories with Jewish mystical themes, having no idea where they were coming from, where they were going to, or that there would one day be enough to put together in a book. Jews have used stories to retell stories, and so do I. The Torah can be sketchy at times and doesn't tell us everything we want to know. For instance, you won't find any mention of Adam's first wife Lilith in its pages, but there are countless stories about her in a wonderful magazine named for her. And it doesn't tell us the name of Noah's wife, but in the ancient book of Jubilees, she's called Zara, and the rabbis of old called her Nama. Sometimes these legends, called midrashim, don't just expand upon the text, but contradict it. Here's an example. In Hebrew school, I was taught that Abraham was the first person to discover God. His father Terach was a pagan and an idol maker, we were told, but Abraham realized that his father's gods were made of metal, wood, or stone, and that there is one true God, not made by humans, but our maker. However, none of these stories are in the Torah. And if we go back to it, we will discover that Abraham's ancestors from Adam and Eve and Noah and his unnamed wife all talked with God, worked for God, disagreed with God, and sometimes went for walks with God, who shall, for the most part, in these stories remain beyond our reductive binary genderings and will be spoken of using this pronoun, it. The same pronoun that I shall use when referring to angels. Doing this, telling, pre-telling, detailing is part of the Jewish tradition. So don't be too surprised if I do it. Well, maybe you could be a little bit surprised. These stories lap and overlap, and play with each other, against each other, as much as they play with older stories. Hopefully, you'll find that all the strands weave together like good cloth, and that all the seams and seams hold together too. In telling these tales, I'm indebted to all the storytellers who've gone before me, known and unknown. But when I said before that I didn't know where these stories come from, I was lying. For you see, although they never told me mystical stories, my father Jack and my mother's mother Nan were excellent storytellers. My mother Jerry read to me every night. My grandfather Lester gave me my first illustrated children's Bible. My grandmother Rose could tell stories all day in English laced with Yiddish threads, and my father's father Max used to call me Buncha from the time that I was very small. I didn't know what that nickname meant till the night, sometime in the late 1950s, when I watched a black and white television show, the only kind, about a poor man named Buncha Schweig, who finds himself in heaven. I've never forgotten that show. It shaped my life and my writing, although it wasn't until I got to college that I learned that the show was a dramatization of the story Buncha Schweig, written by I.L. Peretz in 1894. So that's where these stories come from. And now they're going to you, my listeners, sitting here with me around the virtual tea table of our inventive minds, around the virtual campfire of our imaginations. And in the years since this book began, I've discovered, as perhaps you knew all along, that Jews all over the world are continuing to write mystical stories, all of which do what good stories should do: paint the world for us in all of its resplendent and sometimes imaginary colors. Here's the first story: Forget and Forgive. I'm sorry, Nicanor. It's all right, Oriel, really. No, it isn't. How will you ever forgive me? It's no big deal, really. I wish I hadn't mentioned it. Can we just forget about the whole thing, please? The two of them were sitting side by side, wings wrapped around themselves, on a promontory in a large garden, right on the border between second and third heavens. From there, the view in both directions was spectacular. A sparkling river of light, shimmering peaks, a rippling silver aura above them. How about if I take you out for dinner tonight? Oriel, let's forget about it. It wasn't even a big birthday. You're right, Nicanor. And I did remember your last 1000th. Yes, dear, you did. And you really were surprised by the party, weren't you? Yes. And I loved it. So let's just forget about this one. I mean, we're not getting any younger. When I wake up in the morning, I still feel the way I did when I emerged from the heart of God. But then I get up and look in the mirror and, oh, me too, Nicanor. It seems like only yesterday that I emerged, one spark of light in the midst of countless others, human souls and angels, all of us rising up together and then soaring off to meet our different destinies. You know, sometimes I envy those humans. It's so simple for them. They soar, they circle, and then they embody somewhere. They don't have to figure out if they're going to be good angels or bad angels like we do. They get to be both good and bad. And if they don't like the way they did it, they die, and then they get the chance to embody and try it all over again. Oriel turned to look at Nicanor and spread his left wing tip out toward the tip of Nicanor's right wing, tentatively. For an instant, Nicanor pulled back, still irritated. But then its heart opened up and it reached out its wingtip to meet Oriel's wingtip. When the two wings touched, liquid light poured from tip to tip, radiant and golden. I promise I'll remember next year, Nikaner. I really will. I'm not sure I want you to. Why don't you just wait till it's my next 1000th? In that case, why don't we go up to fourth heaven for a while to celebrate? I'd like that. Good, but don't you think we should get going? Oh my God, you're right. We have that wobbly little planet Earth to attend to, and then that meeting with our supervisors. Standing, taking in the glorious view one last time, the two opened wide their shimmering golden wings and sailed off into the infinite expanse of liquid aqua light that is second heaven's lambent and embracing sky. Rivka's sewing machine. It was an ordinary sewing machine, pale blue electric, that Rivka's twin sister Ruchel gave her when she bought herself a fancy new one. Rivka's husband Morris had just died, and Rivka decided that if she took in some sewing, it would help. Rivka had worked as a seamstress until she retired, but never before had she a machine of her own. Morris, an electrician, had wanted to get her one for years, but she always said no. When she got home at night, the last thing she wanted to do was sew. Still, the work was familiar, and Rivka decided it would be better to be sewing again than to be sitting all day in front of a television set like Yeda and Malki and Sarah and the rest of her widowed friends. In her years of sewing, Rivka had worked on many different machines, old ones with foot pedals and new ones, electric. But in all the time, she had never worked on a machine like the one that Ruchel gave her. Fabric slid through it like water beneath her fingers, and there was something comforting about the way that it hummed at her, like a cat. And her customers all came back to her saying that everything she sewed on it stayed sewed, that her seams never came apart, ripped apart, or even unraveled. It seemed odd to her, very odd, that there was no way except with the scissors that you could separate two pieces of cloth that she had sewn together. Not even the Abramowitz boy downstairs, who worked out every day in an Italian gymnasium and had muscles on his arms that were bigger than the size of his head, could rip apart the blue silk shirt that Rivka made for him for Sister Franny's second wedding. Naturally, by word of mouth, money started to come in as neighbors began to tell others about Rivka and her marvelous work. Day and night, the phone kept ringing with people wanting her to sew for them. A ball gown for a very rich woman with a hunchback, matching bar mitzvah suits for a set of identical triplets, and then 15 costumes for a lesbian traveling circus. The people she sewed for sent her flowers and chocolates and tickets to concerts that she never went to. They all swore by her work. Then, a year after she got that machine from Rachel, the mayor himself came to have her make a suit for him for his second inauguration. Made in New York, he told all the news reporters, which sent half his staff and all his relatives and even other people to Rivka's door. Not just the mayor, but all of Rivka's customers raved about her work. They said she used some special kind of thread that came all the way from Paris. But Rivka knew better. It was ordinary thread she used from Woolworth's right around the corner. Only Rivka was troubled by her work. She'd sewn on much better machines than Rachel's old one. She knew the things that Rachel had sewed on it, and none of them were as good as the work that she'd been doing. On top of that, Rachel was angry, and not just about her sister's sudden fame, but her own new fancy machine kept breaking down. She wished she'd never given her old one to Rivka, especially when she saw the work that her sister was doing on it, and saw how much money she was taking in. But Rachel didn't say anything about it to her widowed sister, and she made her husband Sai promise that he wouldn't say anything either. And so Rivka's business continued to grow till she was making more money working from home than she ever did in all her years of working for the first and then the second Mr. Golden, her old bosses from before she retired. Then one night, Rivka had a dream. In the dream, she saw herself coming back from Rachel's house in a taxi, the day that her sister had given her the sewing machine. Everything was exactly the way that it had been in real life. But then the dream shifted, and Rivka felt as if another eye had opened up right in the middle of her forehead. An eye that could peer through layers of darkness and see what she hadn't been able to see before. Looking out the window of the cab, which was stopped at a red light, Rivka noticed a dark little apartment house across the street. And somehow she could see right into one of the apartments. There, lying in pain on his deathbed, was an old man, a rabbi, cold-hearted, mean-spirited, a widower with 2 daughters he'd alienated. In fact, an entire congregation that he'd slowly over the years twisted, poisoned, pushed away. And she knew in the dream that that old mean rabbi had been a distant cousin of hers on her mother's side, and that he had also been the father of the wife of the second Mr. Golden who she'd worked for. And when he died, Rivka saw very clearly in her dream. She saw that his soul was so heavy with bitterness that it tried but could not rise up to heaven. Instead, it spun, sputtered, and tumbled back down to earth, where it landed with a thud in her sister's sewing machine as she sat with it in her lap that day in the taxi. In the dream, Rivka knew that because the rabbi had ripped so many people's lives apart with his bitterness, cutting them off from his own hearts, just as he had torn himself away from his own, that as a penance, he would have to sew 10,000 perfect seams on her sewing machine, bringing together cloth and cloth over and over and over and over and over again, joining, connecting, making one out of two, making one out of many. And only when he had completed that task, she knew from her dream, would the rabbi's soul be released from Rachel's old sewing machine so that it could at last rise up to heaven. Rivka woke up remembering that dream. Who wouldn't? And then she thought back to the day when she'd brought the sewing machine home and remembered a sudden jolt that nearly sent the machine flying off her lap. At the time, she thought that the taxi had hit a pothole, but now she knew what had really happened. But a rabbi's penance? 10,000 perfect seams? Rivka muttered to herself as she reached for her bathrobe at the foot of the bed, as she sat and put on her house slippers. The sun was just coming up over Bay Parkway as she walked down the hall to the living room. There she unplugged and picked up the sewing machine, although Dr. Feldman had warned her because of her back not to lift a thing. But she picked it up anyway from the little table where it sat beneath the window, and she carried it back down the hall to the coat closet, where she bent with an oi and a groan and slid it onto the floor between two old brown suitcases that she and Morris took with them each summer when they went for a week in the Catskills. Then she shut the door, walked back to the kitchen, and made herself a strong cup of coffee. The extra money had been nice, and Rivka's customers called her for years, begging her to do another job for them. The lesbian traveling circus. She'd made fancy costumes 3 times for them. The Abramowitz boy downstairs. He wanted another shirt for his sister Franny's 3rd wedding. And then Mrs. Lipschitz, a regular, offered to send her to Florida for the winter, if only she would make for her a suit for her little Benji's bar mitzvah. And Mr. Melman, the fancy lawyer from around the corner, you know him, another old customer, he offered to set her up in a little shop of her own if she would only make for him a different suit every season. But nothing, and no one could ever persuade Rivka to sew in other garment on that machine. No, nothing and no one could ever persuade Rivka to sew in other garment on that machine. After all, she and Morris had been communists, and helping out a rabbi, bad or good, just didn't feel kosher to her. Thank you. Last story for today. Thank you.
So Andrew, would you like people to be able to ask questions now, or what would?
That would be fun. Go for it, folks.
So if anybody has a question, they should either they can put it in the chat, or they can press the hand raise button, which is if you press the participants on the bottom, and then that opens up the list of participants. At the bottom of that, there should be a little icon of a hand raise if you want to raise your hand, and then we can unmute you to ask your question or make your comment.
Thanks.
And Andrew, can you see the chat if you press the chat button?
Can see the chat. Hey, Sarah. It's fun to see you. We're sitting here in multiple dimensions in California, Pennsylvania, New York, North Carolina, Washington, D.C. Hey, Scott, it's fun to see you again for the first time in more than 20 years. So thank you for being here. I'm honored and delighted. And thank you, Dan, and thank you everybody there.
Yeah, so Eileen has a question, so I'm going to unmute you. Eileen, you can ask your question or make your comment.
Hi, everybody, family and friends. I loved the story, Andrew. Both stories, particularly Rivka's sewing machine. I love it. And I hope I can read it again. And I loved watching you tell the story, and I loved hearing you tell the story. And it reminds me so much of us, either at my house having sleepovers on the high riser or in your house, and you telling me stories. So that's what it reminds me of. Just wonderful, pleasant, loving memories of you and I. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
Love you.
Love you all. So the references, of course, to Brooklyn and Bay Parkway are literally
Yes.
where our ancestors came from in Brooklyn.
Right.
Yeah. Other questions? Comments? Critiques? Hopefully some of you fell asleep. Well, if there are no more, and maybe there will, I'll wait a bit, and then we can wait a bit. I'll be back next Sunday.
Hello? I can't raise
Wait,
my hand.
there is a question. You can I can hear you, so you can.
Can you hear me now? I mean, I was talking to Dale. I'm also Andrew's cousin. I think he has a cousins club of us, of stars.
Yeah. Two friends,
Anyway,
45 cousins. Hey,
I just
Dale.
wanted to say you just inspired me by the idea of Jewish mystical stories. I just realized that I have the story that I'm going to write thanks to you. Thanks.
Oh, great. Dale is an amazing writer, as some of you know, and an incredible resource, and amongst other things, a disability rights activist. So yay.
You can hear him telling another story now. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Andrew, I love the notion and the fair, justified, justice-oriented way you describe how Abraham wasn't the first person to have a relationship with God. Because I think all of us can safely say we were all taught in Kita Gimel as third graders or second graders. Abraham had this conversation with God and he was the first one. And you just blew my mind, because also reading that Cain and Abel and all the other characters before him, his ancestors, also talked to God, and I never questioned it. And I love that you say, you offer that there's permission to have that contradiction between Midrash and the actual writing in the literature and go back and forth. You're much kinder and more generous than I would be about it.
Thank you. I had such amazing teachers all through my life, and continue to, who remind me of what a story is. And on a certain level, the entire Torah is a midrash on way older stories, which we wouldn't know about if it wasn't for 18th and 19th and 20th century archaeologists finding cuneiform tablets and discovering way older stories. So a story, goes back to ancient times. And my understanding of a story, this is one of my stories about stories, is that there was no spoken language.
Right.
And if you've read about this, the children who are taught to sign are fluent 6 months earlier than children who are taught to speak. The brain is hardwired. And my theory is that stories got to be so good that people invented fire, not to cook or to stay warm, but so that people could tell stories all night. And then at some point it got verbal. So, thanks for what you said. It's just so fun. I mean, when's the last time we saw each other? In the 80s?
It was 89.
Yeah. So it's cool to see you again. So thank you. I hope you have many stories to tell and retell and dismantle. So thanks, Scott. This is so fun.
You're welcome.
Andrew, on that score, I'm curious if you've been thinking about a new cycle of stories that might be inspired by this new time in which we're living, where you can ironically see someone that you haven't seen in 20 years at the time that everybody thinks is the most distancing of times.
That I think is just so lovely. And in some ways, yes. And in other ways, for those of you who've seen fragments of the Brooklyn Talmud, some of what's going on now, I got. Only I thought it was going to happen in 40 or 50 years, not in a few months. You can't go out without a breathing mask. there's a giant pandemic, which in this book, a sixth of all of humanity dies from. It's scary. There's a wonderful article that my brother sent me about a rabbi in 1813 responding to the cholera epidemic. Beautiful, beautiful article about what was going on then about social distancing. It's for the very first time they were beginning to understand contagion. So this will probably turn into something, and you'll hear about it, I promise, Dad.
Great.
I have another comment, which is I was thinking about the end of the Rivka's sewing machine, where you said, that they were from, they were from the group that thought religion was the opiate of the masses, and just helping a rabbi just didn't seem right. And that's in our family, Andrew. Our family we were all red diaper babies, and to a certain extent. And there was like a whole group of Jewish people who thought religion was the opiate of the masses. And I think Rivka very much symbolizes that. I think my mom would have been right with her.
So here's a story with ripple stories. Eileen and I were talking earlier in the day, and I said that I remembered my mother telling me that on May Day, every year, Zeta, our great-grandfather, would hang a red flag from the front porch of the third floor that came almost all the way to the ground, and how mortifying that was for my mother and Eileen's mother. I don't know if any of the rest of you remember that story, but I've always thought about it every May Day, since I'm named after the guy who hung the flag.
Wow.
Well, I bless you, Andrew, for hanging out your flag tonight for us.
Thank you. I am so glad to see you again, and it's been fun. Like little by little, both the face that was stored in my brain from all those years ago and this face are coming together, and a file is opening. So I hope we'll stay in touch.
Yeah.
This is great. So thank you for joining us.
Sure. Thanks for the invite. I gotta go do my laundry.
Go.
Good to meet you all. Blessings. Thank you.
Blessings.
Thanks,
So,
Andrew. Thank you,
all.
Andrew. Love
This
you.
was joyous. I love
Thank
you
you.
all. I am very grateful.
Thank you.
And we'll continue and share the word. I would love to have friends of yours, and you have cousins I'm not related to. Maybe they want to come too.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Goodbye, goodbye. And maybe you,
Love
Dan,
you.
and I will hang out
Bye.
for a minute. Bye, everybody.